happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in Georgia's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
Well, that was a powerful tribute to George Floyd, the unarmed black man who was killed by a white police officer last month in the United States. People around the country are outraged, indeed around the world. Protests in all 50 states have been buttressed by protests in dozens of countries.
Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd!
One of the most touching tributes came from the mother of his little girl.
I want justice for him because he was good. No matter what anybody thinks, he was good. And this is the proof that he was a good man.
Well, it's all very sad, and at this tragic time for George Floyd's family and friends, you think that no one would contradict their account of him as a gentle giant and a devout Christian, but you'd be wrong. A leading conservative political activist, Candace Owens, has called Floyd a horrible human being on Facebook. Her video has had more than 85 million views at the time of recording. In the video, she argues that Floyd was a career criminal who shouldn't be made into a black hero or a martyr. She also says the notion of widespread racist police brutality is a myth. This is a woman with important connections and political aspirations who claims to be trying to lead black people to a better future. But is she? In a moment, we'll speak to her friend and conservative political ally, Brandon Tatum. He was a policeman for 6 years in Tucson, Arizona. We'll also hear from two Democrats, trial lawyer Titus Nichols and another former policeman, Reddit Hudson, who left the force to focus on addressing problems in the criminal justice system. But first, for those of you who don't know her, here's a quick introduction to the woman who shocked America.
Hello, Facebook family. I have decided to do this video. It has been weighing very heavily on my heart. I want to come out and say that I do not support George Floyd and the media depiction of him as a martyr for Black America. I'm going to explain why, and I hope that some of you guys will understand where I'm coming from.
I can breathe.
I want to be very clear. What I'm saying is not any defense for Derek Chauvin. I hope Derek Chauvin gets the justice that he deserves to be, implemented upon him, and that the family of George Floyd deserves justice. George Floyd was not an amazing person. First and foremost, George Floyd at the time of his arrest was high on fentanyl and he was high on methamphetamine. And I want to talk about what his lifestyle was. 10 months in prison for theft with a firearm, 8 months in prison for a cocaine offense, another 10 months in prison for a cocaine offense, another 10 months in prison for having less than 1 gram of cocaine on him. In 2007, a woman who was pregnant received a knock at the door. 5 men, one of which was George Floyd, forced their way inside to her home. George Floyd took out a gun and pressed it to her stomach. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for that instance. George Floyd was a criminal. He was a criminal. And just because he was a criminal doesn't mean he deserved to die at the knee of a police officer. But it does mean that I am not going to play a part of the broken Black culture that always wants to martyr criminals.
She is being used as a pawn in the chess game that is politics and the chess game that is issues of race in this country.
It's absolute nonsense. We're not celebrating criminality, okay? What protesters are asking for right now, and it should be a simple ask. Stop murdering people.
I wonder if you've actually remember what it's like to be a Black person in America.
Okay, let's bring in our panel now. And in St. Louis, Missouri, we have the retired policeman, Reddit Hudson. In Atlanta, Georgia, we have law professor Titus Nichols. And finally, in Phoenix, Arizona, Brandon Tatum. Brandon, I'd like to start with you. You know Candace personally. You've worked with her. Just for our international audience, can you explain who is she? What motivates her? What does she stand for?
I think Candace Owens is a tremendous asset to the political conversation. She's bold, she's smart, she's courageous, and she has a lot of impactful things to say. A lot of it comes on Twitter, but she's also a activist that puts her actions where her mouth is at. Me and Candace Owens co-founded Blexit. Blexit is a nonprofit organization that gets people to be open-minded. Some of which what we do is try to have African Americans in the United States leave the idea that you have to be a Democrat because you're Black. We have chapters in several states in this country, in the United States of America, and we're working together just to continue to keep the conversation moving forward and to keep compelling arguments there. Whether people agree with us or not, we're going to continue to make statements that are bold and challenge the narrative.
Some people say she's an attention seeker, she's self-serving, and that she put this video out, she knew it would be incendiary, just to get attention. What do you think?
No, I know her personally. She don't care about attention. I think she's a person that's going to speak her mind, and this is something that's probably been brewing in her, like it's been brewing in me, about what is going on in our country and the destruction of our country. Not necessarily the fault of George Floyd, but to have a balanced argument and give, the side of who he really is, juxtaposed to the things that people are rising him up to as if he's a martyr or as if he should be honored like a god in some cases. Candace is not out here just trying to get attention. I think she just says what she feel, and if you follow anything that she do, that's what she does all the time.
What is her relationship with President Donald Trump?
I mean, I don't know her personal relationship with President Donald Trump. I know that she's been to the Oval Office, she met the president, and she's a supporter of Donald Trump.
There's speculation that she's looking for political office come 2024, perhaps at a congressional level. I'm not sure. What do you think she wants to do in the future?
Yeah, there's an aspiration that she's identified to me. She's actually shared it on her social media. I think it's a good move for her to be able to be in a political position to make a difference in Congress, maybe in the Senate. So I think that's something that she's thinking about. We'll see if she actually runs for office at some point.
Titus, we've heard from Brandon that she's a genuine person. She genuinely cares about the African American community and that she's just trying to steer them in the correct direction. What do you make of her?
Well, I can't speak to her personal motivations because I've never met Candace Owens before. But what I can say as far as the product that she's putting out or what she's trying to sell, if she's trying to sell the idea that Black people are better served by the Republican Party, she's doing a bad job at selling it. You can focus all day by saying, well, only X number of people were killed by police in this year, or statistics say that, but you're ignoring the context of what's going on in the world and specifically what's going on in the country. If you're going to have a conversation about what political party Black people should follow, then that's a conversation worth having. But simply saying by creating terms like Blexit, which is based upon the very controversial term of a Brexit, which that in itself is based on xenophobia and anti-immigration, you're not doing a good job as a showing why the other side is better than what's going on right now.
Reddit, she's had 85 million views at last count of that video. How important is she in the United States, and how representative are her views for the African American community?
I don't pay much attention to Candace Owens, frankly. Most of my peers and colleagues do not either. I don't think that she's very important other than the fact that she highlights that this is a free country and free speech is still a thing here, as long as Donald Trump can keep his hands off of that. Most Blacks do not feel represented by her views. I do know that from what I've seen on social media. She usually is a voice that is greatly diminished by most in the Black community. However, there is some truth to the fact that we are not an autonomous, homogenous group of people. There are a range of views in the Black community. There's a whole range in the political spectrum in the Black community, and that's fine. Relative to the Republicans in this country, man, they are currently in the process of actively trying to suppress the vote. We just saw yesterday in Georgia, yet again, they actively suppressed the vote in Black and brown communities. They are responsible for caging children at our southern border. Even as we speak, there are still children in cages. They are complicit in their support of Donald Trump. It's hard for me to see the principle in it, and it's easier for me to see the media attention aspect of it without knowing her personally, so I can't say 100% for sure either way.
Okay. Her main claim is that whilst she doesn't begrudge George Floyd's family justice, while she absolutely agrees that he didn't deserve to die in this way and that the police officer, perhaps officers, deserve the justice that's coming to them, what she says she cannot tolerate is for someone who's been a career criminal, in her words, to be held up by the black community as a hero or as a martyr. You know, what do you make of that?
I'll tell you this, man. I am a former police officer, as you have said. I've been shot at here in St. Louis, widely considered one of the most dangerous cities in the country, sometimes ranked as one of the most dangerous cities in the world. George Floyd is not being held up as a martyr. He's being held up as a human being who was sadistically murdered in front of all of us at a culminating point when we've seen through generations a disregard for black life in this country, which was founded upon white supremacy, and every institution that we have is framed around institutional racism that defines it. We are tired, people are tired of watching police officers and law enforcement people who are sworn to protect us take our lives with zero accountability.
Candace Owens is arguing that she's trying to straighten out a narrative that has been subverted for political purposes. What does that mean?
This incident was very unfortunate, what happened to George Floyd. I think it was wrong. I think the police officer should be prosecuted for it, and he has been. But this has nothing to do with race. There's no implication that it's racially motivated. To me, based on what I see, this is a cop that did something wrong, and it just so happened to be a person who was black at the other end of it. He has a track record of doing things improperly, not only to black people, but white people. So it's a bad police officer. When you look at what Candace Owens said about the martyrdom, I think that people have held him as a martyr. His funeral is celebrated on every network. He had 3 funerals, completely violating social distancing and coronavirus restrictions. People have been able to attend his funeral. Everywhere you go, you see George Floyd's name being presented. What you do not see is you don't see the names of other African-American people who have died in this country that didn't die at the hands of a white police officer. You don't see their names being touted. You don't see them getting credibility. So that's what Candace Owens is referring to.
What say you to that, Titus?
I feel that Candace's position is, quite frankly, disrespectful to George Floyd as a human being, and it just shows that her routine is just to be as incendiary as possible. I'm a former prosecutor. I've prosecuted murderers, gang members, bank robbers, child molesters, every horrible crime you could think of. And every time I had a defendant, I still recognized their humanity. I recognized that they were entitled to the same rights and treatment as anybody else. And just because they have a criminal record, just because they've been accused of a horrible crime, does not mean that you do not treat them with the same basic humanity that you treat anybody else. George Floyd is being recognized because his humanity was not recognized by the police officer.
And we are going to get into the statistics that were presented in her video in just a moment in much more detail. While it is true that George Floyd did have a criminal record, he was also widely reported to have been a reformed character. He had not been convicted of anything since his release from prison in 2014. He did community work with the church, and he planned to open a restaurant with his girlfriend of 3 years.
He is such a spiritual man, beyond just being prayerful and a man of God. He had a sense about him that just made you feel comforted, feel good, feel validated.
Now, in addition to attacking George Floyd's character, Candace Owens also argues that the notion of widespread police brutality, racist police brutality, is a myth in the United States. She's not the only conservative activist or commentator to do this, and at first glance, the statistics put forward out of context appear to back her up.
Every year, police in the United States shoot dead almost exactly 1,000 people. Each incident is recorded by the Washington Post, which began its database in 2015, the last full year of Barack Obama's presidency. The leaders changed, but the numbers are remarkably consistent. Last year, as always, the vast majority of people shot dead by police were men. 40% were white, 24% were black, a statistic jumped on by conservative commentators.
More white suspects were killed.
But that's not the full story. There are, of course, far more white people in America, and taking that into account, African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be shot dead by police. But Candace Owens disputes even this.
It doesn't matter what percentage of the population you represent, it matters what percentage of the violent criminal community you represent. And unfortunately, black community commits a disproportionate amount of crimes compared to the white community.
Now back to the data. Of the 1,003 people shot dead by police last year, 95% were armed, typically with a gun. Just 5%, 55 people, were unarmed. Nearly half, 25, were white. 14 were black. To be clear then, a total of 14 unarmed black people were shot dead by police last year. In most cases, officers were not charged because the suspect was either trying to flee or attack them. But in 2 cases, officers were charged for the killing of Atatiana Jefferson and separately Gregory Griffin. Conservative commentators say the data show police may not be perfect, but they're far from systemically racist. Others argue that racism in the police is so deep-rooted and takes so many forms that it can't be captured by the numbers alone.
Well, that's the problem with statistics, isn't it? Brandon, I'd like to come with you. It's a simple question, really. Is there widespread, deep-rooted racism amongst America's police or not?
No, I don't think that there's any evidence unequivocally that there's widespread racism in this country. I think a lot of people are making it up because it gives them an excuse to push an agenda. When you look at any of the stats, actually white people are killed more, killed unarmed more, and experience police brutality more than the black community. And people love to say that it's the population difference that's the reason why whites are experiencing that, but it's not true because police don't patrol every single person in the country. They patrol the criminal element. And when you look at the criminal element, African-American people of 13% of the population, reduce that to the criminal element of that population, which is about 6% or less, commit half of the murders in this country and over half of the violent crimes. So disproportionate crime committing will get you disproportionate policing, which will have disproportionate incarceration. So there's number and statistics that deal with this that's outside of the realm of believing in systemic racism. It's just not true. I think that if we find a racist person, a racist police officer doing a racist act, we need to address that one officer and stick to that instead of bringing up a theory that can never be proven, never be validated, and we can never fix.
Are you saying that in your 6 years or 6.5 years as a police officer, you didn't witness police acting in a racist fashion?
No, I never met a racist police officer, never seen anybody act in a racist manner. The bad cops that I saw, the ones who were disrespectful and rude, they were disrespectful and rude to black, white, and other police officers. So is there racist people out there? Yeah, of course, there's going to always be racist people out there. But to claim that it's systemic, we need to see more evidence, and we need to find these people, and we need to remove them from the police department and prosecute them appropriately. But until then, there's no reason to make a claim of systemic anything if you don't have unequivocal proof.
Reddit, what does your time on the police force tell you about racism in the police?
I have a completely different perspective than the gentleman who just spoke. Not only me, but all of my colleagues, my predecessors, blacks in law enforcement that paved the way for me. We are clear with the National Association of Law Enforcement Officers for Justice Reform and Accountability, which is a coalition of officers that goes from New York to Los Angeles. Systemic racism is at the foundation of criminal justice in America. I don't even think it's up for legitimate debate. When you legislate inequity into the law, you get targeted enforcement. For example, with the war on drugs, when you make it a crime to have 5 grams of crack cocaine back when that was the thing that people were using, but you needed 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same mandatory sentence that the drug carried, you see where the crack cocaine was going to be most prevalent in poor communities where the cheaper cost of the drug made it accessible to people. Those things are known. When you talk about more white people being killed by police than blacks, white people also kill more police officers than blacks, but that narrative is never fully expressed here in the States. So my experience is vastly different, and that is why the advocacy that I'm engaged in and others around this country are engaged in is there to address the reality that systemic racism and racial profiling are things that we have tried to legislate out of being, advocate out of being, but until officers are really held accountable for their daily violations, and it doesn't always rise to the level of some violent act like what we saw with George Floyd, it's the daily abuse in Black communities that we've experienced for years.
That's what I wanted to ask you, Titus, about. As Reddit was saying, it doesn't always rise to the level of a fatal shooting, but other activists I've spoken to in preparation for this show say, look, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's a daily thing. It's a daily struggle. Can you explain that?
And that's why I believe the question of, is there rampant racism within police? I just don't think that's a succinct or a good enough question, because to ask that, it puts the focus solely on the police force and not looking at the broader criminal justice system. There are systemic flaws throughout the entirety of the criminal justice system. If you look at here in Georgia, the situation with Ahmaud Arbery, where it took 2 months to arrest his murderers. That wasn't because the police officers didn't do their job. It's because the prosecutors refused to do their job and tried to cover for the killers. And so this issue you see is bigger than just law enforcement. It goes into who gets arrested, what is charged. As Reddit previously stated, the inconsistency between being charged with crack cocaine versus powder cocaine goes well beyond law enforcement. That goes into the prosecutors, the judges, and the legislators that create the laws. So you see this continuum of discrimination and who it mostly affects. That's where you have to look at. And if Candace Owens was really focused on so-called delivering Black people to the other side, she would focus on that as opposed to narrowing down on the small statistics of saying, oh, well, more white people are killed. Here's a novel, crazy idea. How about law enforcement not kill any unarmed citizen, whether it's Black or white? If that's accomplished, you're going to see better results across the board.
That's not possible. Just because you're unarmed doesn't mean that you're not a deadly threat. So when you look at the use of force continuum, that's not possible. But let's look at two people real quick, and we'll talk about the criminal justice system. George Floyd went to prison 9 times. He didn't spend any significant time in prison. He was let out and given multiple chances. And at the time of his death, he was high on methamphetamine and committing crimes. The individual who killed David Dorn, the retired police captain, that individual had been arrested for armed robbery. He was supposed to do 7 years in prison. He got probation. He violated his probation multiple times. He ended up in a store killing retired police officer, retired Captain David Dorn. So when you talk about criminal justice system, you have to be specific. The people that I've seen that I've arrested, they don't have any more injustice than I've seen amongst other people who are white. My cousin, for a perfect example, he got 70 years in prison. He was a convicted felon. He was a prohibited possessor. He shot 3 people. He's only going to do 15 years in prison. He's eligible for parole. My uncle did 40 years federal time because he was selling dope for multiple years, and now he's only going to do 15 because of the First Step Act. So it's not this pervasive injustice through racism. I don't believe in that. And if we can have a conversation about what judge is a racist, let's point that judge out, get him out of there, and then we can see some changes.
Reddit, I'd like to come to you because Brandon mentioned David Dorn. Now that gentleman was killed in your area, St. Louis, and Candace Owens uses his killing to make the point that Black lives only matter when white people take it. When Black people are killed within their own community, no one seems to create an equal amount of protest about that.
And that's just false. First of all, I worked for David Dorn. David Dorn was my captain when I came out of the academy in the 8th District for the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. I know David Dorn personally. I knew him, and we were all deeply hurt when he lost his life. It is false to say that we don't respond when Blacks take other Black lives, especially here in St. Louis. I don't know what brother has been, but all over the country, there are marches against intra-community violence repeatedly and consistently. We rise up to challenge our own community members when they take life in our community. What we also know is the underlying conditions that create the circumstances in which violence thrives: abject poverty, broken schools, lack of home ownership, dismal employment prospects, poor health care, no healthy food available, and desperation laid over the top of it. And then you drop guns into that situation or that setting anywhere on the planet, that you create those conditions, you're going to get the violence you get. How do we get those conditions? What's created?
Democrats.
Systemic disinvestment in communities, targeted and legislated inequity in our laws. All of those things feed that. But to invoke Captain Doran's name in defense of the arguments that you're making, brother, which really are just a plain denial of the lived experience of the vast majority of African Americans in this country from its inception to the present, is disappointing.
Okay, Reddit Hudson, Titus Nichols, and Brandon Tatum, thank you all very much for your contribution to the Nexus today. I really appreciate it. And thank you at home for watching. Remember, you can see this episode and all our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Until next week, then, goodbye. Well, thanks for watching our program. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends and family, and even subscribe.